Brother Gary's prayer and teaching the lesson, and any time that brethren mention me in their prayers for my preaching to be effective and so on, that's always important. Preachers are just like anybody else. They, a lot of times we may think that preachers, we have the same problems as everybody, and we get into slumps just like anybody else, and we are certainly thankful when people pray for our preaching. Some may take it as an insult, not me. I covet your prayers, so as I pray for myself also. Good to see everyone out this evening. Love to see all the faces out. The psalmist said, "They that fear thee will be glad when they see me, because I have hoped in thy word," and that goes for any faithful Christian. So you're always an encouragement, whether you know it or not, or whether you think that you are or not. You are definitely an encouragement when you come out to the assemblies any time with the saints. Also, before we get into the lesson, I want to mention I went out to the nursing home today and had a visit with Joanne. It was pretty good. She was really tired. It's sleeping weather today. So yeah. You may have enjoyed your midday nap as I did. It's one of those days. She was just very groggy, but in the meantime, while she was there and I was with her, I had others that were talking to me. So it's always beneficial. There's this one lady. She said, "That's a good-looking suit you got there." She goes, "I think you look good in a green suit." And I said, I don't know about that. I said, I've been looking for a dark brown one. I can't find it. I said, "I got a gray, a light blue, a dark blue, and a tan." I said, "I want a dark brown." I said, "I don't know about green."
I'm not real keen on a brown suit.
Yeah, I've been looking for one. I don't think they sell them, so you're in luck. So.
I like gray and blue and black.
You need you a dark brown pair of slacks and a green jacket. And let's call it the tree suit.
Maybe that was, they talk about puke green carpets back in the day in the 60s and stuff. Maybe that was her time period, but I was like, I ain't getting no green suit.
Avocado green.
Avocado green.
The color of my parents' toilet and tub.
That used to be in style, I guess, but.
Our first house.
There was
green
avocado.
No, it was mint green.
There was three colors in your house. There was avocado, there was copper tone, and harvest gold.
Yep. And copper tone was orange, right?
My mom's was copper tone.
Oh, okay. So
yeah, that goes way back.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. I've seen some pictures and stuff, and I remember, my grandmother's house and stuff, colors like that. So, but
yeah, right on that note, not just with Joanne, but I know that what you are doing when you visit with the elderly like that has an impact on not only on them, but the people see the good works that people are doing, and it carries weight.
Oh yeah, they know that people know when you care. You can't really counterfeit that. People can tell whenever you're generally interested. So that's always a good thing there. So we're in Deuteronomy chapter 21. And as we go through here, we need to remember we're in the middle of a speech still. Long speech. Chapter 5 to, I believe it's chapter 26. Soon enough, we'll be out of this speech. And before you know it, we'll actually be done. Well, we're not that far along, but we're getting closer to the end of Deuteronomy. Are there any questions or comments up to this point? I hope we're doing good and understanding pretty well. And look, I know you guys are not going to understand everything. I don't understand everything in these books because it takes a lifetime of study. But we do know some things, and my goal is not to go through and show you every little detail. Although you may think that sometimes when I get down showing you stuff, but. My goal is to show you the overall view of what's going on. The fact that Moses, he's speaking to this second generation. He's simply trying to let them see how they can succeed, how they can avoid the failure of the first generation. And as he's doing that, he's who else better to do that? Moses has been there from the beginning, and he's learned from his own mistakes. God said, "You're not going in." So who better to listen to? You better listen to me, because God has told me that I'm not going to get to go in. So do what I say, that way that you can go in and you can be successful. And so Moses, although he will not make it into the promised land, he would be in glory, and he knew that. He knew that the land was not the ultimate in God's eyes. And so we see here that he's speaking to them. And we've seen different laws, and he's emphasized the heart. He's emphasized love for God and to not forget. The theme of Deuteronomy, not to forget and to remember. And so we're up to chapter 21. In this chapter, we're going to see different things about how they would treat people from other nations in certain situations. I think we're going to be dealing some more here with some arbitrary war that we looked at last week, where the 7 main nations, God said, these are already determined for destruction. They're already under the ban, if you will. So, but after they did that, there would be other people. There would be other groups of people surrounding in the areas there. So, if arbitrarily they end up getting into a confrontation, he's kind of giving some principles and things like that of what could go down and how they would handle that. So chapter 21, verse 1, he says, if one be found slain in the land, which the Lord thy God giveth thee to possess it, lying in the field, and it be not known who has slain him, then thy elders and thy judges shall come forth, and shall measure unto the cities which are round about him that is slain. And it shall be that the city which is next unto the slain man, even the elders of that city shall take a heifer. Does that sound familiar? Remember the red heifer we studied in the book of Numbers? It's been a while. But now this is not the same thing, but I just wanted you to know, when you see that word heifer, we studied in Numbers. If you remember, if there was somebody who touched the body of the dead, they were unclean. And Moses gave this entirely new regulation in the book of Numbers where they take the red heifer. This is a sacred deal for the Jewish people. They would take this red heifer and burn the heifer and take the ashes and mix it with the water, and they had the water purifying because after the sentence of staying in the land or staying in the wilderness 40 years, there would be people passing off continuously. And this to impress upon the people that sin, the consequences for sin is death. Every time they touched that dead body, he said, here's the ceremony you're going to go through. And this is a whole new ceremony. So just remember that, keep that in mind as we look at this part. Because this is dealing with a dead body here. If they find a carcass in the land and they don't know how it happened, he says here how you deal with it. He says in verse 3, it shall be that the city which is next to the slain man, even the elders of that city shall take a heifer which hath not been wrought with, which hath not drawn in the yoke. In other words, ceremonially clean, not been used in any kind of labor or anything like that. The elders of that city shall bring down the heifer unto a rough valley, which is neither eared nor sown, and shall strike off the heifer's neck there in the valley. And the priests, the sons of Levi, shall come near, for them the Lord thy God hath chosen to minister unto the Lord, and by their word shall every controversy and every stroke be tried. And all the elders of that city that are next unto the slain man shall wash their hands over the heifer that is beheaded in the valley. And they shall answer and say, our hands have not shed this blood, neither have our eyes seen it. Be merciful, O Lord, unto thy people Israel, whom thou hast redeemed, and lay not innocent blood unto thy people of Israel's charge, and the blood shall be forgiven them. So shalt thou put away guilt of innocent blood from among you, when thou shalt do that which is right in the sight of the Lord. And so, as I said, this is a case where they don't know what happened. It's like, does anybody remember the show Unsolved Mysteries? Yeah. Sometimes things happen in this world, and it never, in this lifetime, we're never going to know what happened. And so they said, if you find a body, a carcass in the land, here's the ceremony that you go through. And it involved a heifer. Now, it doesn't say red heifer, but it's a strange ceremony, is it not? I mean, to take a heifer and take it down to a rough valley and just decapitate the heifer. Now, really what this all boils down to, since they don't know what happened to the man, unless the man had been killed wrongly, if he'd been murdered, this is the way that they would handle, that heifer being slain was like that man that murdered that man taking the place, the heifer taking the place. In other words, it was a punishment, in a sense, for that murder taking place. This goes all the way back to Genesis chapter 9, verse 6, where the law was laid down that whosoever sheds man's blood by man's blood, or by man his blood shall be shed. And so we see the back in Genesis the principle that we have for capital punishment today. When somebody murders somebody, that's what happens to them. They get the same punishment. And so he says, if you come up on a case and you don't know if you can't figure out what happened, here's how you handle it. And it's an interesting ceremony to think about, though, as I said, to do this. But from what I gather from it, it seems that the heifer is kind of like the sacrifice. Taking the place, the punishment for the man that murdered the person, if that be the case. And of course, they wouldn't know, but just in case. Just to be safe about it, this is what they would do.
I'm not sure if it matters, but I have break the heifer's neck, not decapitate it. So, because there's nothing mentioned about the blood from the heifer being part of the sacrifice. It just says wash your hands over the dead heifer.
Yeah.
So it basically just kill it.
Well, in verse 6, it says, in the end of the verse there, to wash their hands over the heifer that was beheaded in the valley. So that's where I was getting at.
Again, so yeah. I don't
There
know.
may be a translation issue there. I didn't check, but, it could be. But it seems to me that either
dead. I guess that's the
something
point.
happened here.
Either way,
Yeah.
it was sacrificed.
Right.
Right. It was.
But it doesn't seem like the blood of the heifer was what was key. Just that you killed that heifer.
This is obviously, what Sister Darlene's pointing out here, and this is not your average. This is not your typical sacrifice. This is not, they're not at the altar.
Yeah.
they're not sprinkling the blood, or the blood's not running down into the altar or nothing. They're simply doing something. They have to do something because there's an innocent life taken, or so that may seem. And so there's something that needs to be done. And so this is what God said you do when you come upon that situation. And it would be very likely to come upon that situation, to run across just, a carcass that had, and they don't know what happened in the situation they were in with the wars and things that were taking place. So interesting concept there, but he says this is how you take care just in case there was a murder that had taken place. So then in verse 10, he says, "Well, now goest forth to war against thine enemies, and the Lord thy God hath delivered them into thine hands, and thou hast taken them captive, and seest among the captives a beautiful woman, and hast a desire unto her, that thou wouldest have her to thy wife. Then thou shalt bring her home to thine house, and she shall shave her head and pare her nails." First of all, this is another strange situation here. This is odd to us to read things like this. Again, this is an arbitrary. If they get into an arbitrary confrontation after they've already rid the land of the 7 nations, the 7 main nations in there, the Canaanites. If there was, he said, this is what you can do when you slay all the males. You can take the women to be wives and into the nation of Israel. And can anybody think of a reason why he says you might shave her head and pare her nails?
To cause them. This is, I've thought about this one.
I'm glad you did, because it's a strange verse.
There are things which men will do in the heat of the moment. And going in and basically destroying a city with people in it. God is telling them, and I'm going to use examples, that like when Vikings went in, let's just say the exchanges were brutal and immediate. God is saying, no, you will not be like the Vikings. You're not going to go in, see a woman, have desire for her, and do whatever you want to do.
Yeah.
He's saying, 1, you're going to give her a month to mourn. 2, you're going to have her shave her head and trim her nails. Because a lot of times men, in the heat of the moment, cast their eyes on a woman. It's like, hey, she's got a nice hairdo. Basically, he's making them, forcing them to stop and think before they act.
Right.
Yeah, it may be so that they look like a man, so nobody else will try to hurt them.
Well, Brother Scotty's hitting the nail
Yeah,
on the head pretty good. And maybe what you said too, but it's either one or two things. And the first one being what Scotty said, when when they see, they're in a situation where if wars take place, that war is never good. And number one, Israel was not, as other nations, when they went to war, it was not a conquest as such to establish their power. That's not really what it was about. Now, they had to establish it to some degree, but God said, here's how you're going to do it. And you see how civil God is. He says, whenever you do this, the women that are left, that'd be a tragic experience. Yeah. So to shave their head and pare their nails, for one, that'd give the time for mourning, as you said. That's one thing. Another thing that came to my mind was it could be for them as a sign of them. What's the word I'm looking for? Casting off their idolatrous identity. If there was anything with their hair or their nails that was identified with their idolatrous practice, that was a way of renouncing. That's the word. It was on the tip of my tongue.
Well, it wasn't just that. They also were supposed to take off the garments that they wore in their native land, their native garments, so to speak, because I'm sorry, in some of those parts of the world, there have been parts of the world where the women aren't very modestly dressed. Yeah. And basically God's saying, you're going to cool it.
It's a complete renovation. It's like, here's the sign.
Like you say, they conquested this, and you can't just go there and lord over this woman who has lost everything, essentially. Basically, you're taking her in as part of the family, so to speak. Give her time to adjust.
He said, you're not going to go in there and just ride through town and loot and pillage. You're going to do this my way, and it's going to be civil.
And here's the other thing, too.
The war's already bad enough.
You will notice, this is something that I noticed, too. If you take a look at what God says, if this Israelite is not going to keep her, he basically tells this Israelite, you can't turn her into a slave. He's in effect giving her the same status as a Hebrew. Hebrews were not allowed to be kept permanently as slaves unless they agreed to it, and they had the whole all through the ear on the doorpost and all this other good stuff because they chose to stay with this master forever. But he's basically saying, you're not going to turn her into merchandise. You're not going to turn her into a slave. You're going to let her go wherever she wants to go. If she wants to leave, you let her leave.
It's a way of God saying, since this person is going to be, for all intents and purposes, an Israelite, here's the sign of renouncing all the idolatry and giving time to mourn and to kind of give a buffer in between that, because war is never good. And I didn't read verses 13 and 14 gets a little further about what you mentioned. It says she shall.
Jumped ahead a little bit.
That's all right. She shall put the raiment of her captivity from off her, and shall remain in thine house, and bewail her father and her mother for a full month. And after that thou shalt go in unto her and be her husband, and she shall be thy wife. It shall be, if thou have no delight in her, then thou shalt let her go whither she will, but thou shalt not sell her at all for money. Thou shalt not make merchandise of her. And as you said, you see how God's trying to take the situation as it is and trying to make it as civil as possible. And if you think about it, they had to do something, because if a male, let's say a male from another nation decided, I want to worship the true God, he could do that. Now, he had to go through the process of circumcision. He had to do something. So the females had to do something to signify that this old life is done, and here I'm placing my allegiance to the God of Israel. And this would be one way of doing it. So you think about Rahab. When they went in to take the land, she said, whoa. We've heard, me and my house want to, we've heard what you guys done. We want to worship Jehovah. And so she was able to be brought in, grandfathered in, or however you want to say it. She was able to come into the covenant of Israel, even though she didn't have Abraham's blood in her veins. And all the emphasis that the Jews put on Abraham, well, when you get to James chapter 2, an inspired writer, who does he put side by side? Abraham and Rahab. Now, that was a rebuke to the Israel even at that time, to let them know it was never ultimately about that. The fact that you could pull your genealogies out and say, yep, look, all the way back to Abraham. It was never about that. Not ultimately. And so we see there that God is interested in the heart. So moving on here, in verse 15, he says, if a man have two wives, one beloved and another hated, and they have borne him children, both the beloved and the hated, and if the firstborn son be hers that was hated, then it shall be when he maketh his sons to inherit that which he hath, that he may not make the son of the beloved firstborn before the son of the hated, which is indeed the firstborn. But he shall acknowledge the son of the hated for the firstborn by giving him a double portion of all that he hath, for he is the beginning of his strength. The right of the firstborn is his. And so, at this time, the firstborn, that was, they had all the privileges. And he says here, if it happens to be, now, if you're wondering whether that's polygamy or not, I don't know. It may not be, but it may just be.
Even if it was a matter of divorce.
It may be a matter of divorce.
You did read in the New Testament where they were talking to Jesus and they said, Moses allowed us to give a writ of divorcement. This law would carry through regardless. It wouldn't matter if it was polygamy or if it was a matter of divorce. Your firstborn was your firstborn, period. Yeah,
and if they were that fickle, as Jesus said they were, and I'll take his word, in the days that he was there, it was very likely that he's talking about, that you had a first marriage and you've already let him say, you've already said he's going to inherit. You can't then divorce her for some arbitrary reason and have another wife and then say, well, I want to give the firstborn inheritance to him. No, he said you can't do that. And so he's just, he's anticipating things that may come up. And he's going ahead and nipping it in the bud so that way when it gets down.
He's anticipating them running out and doing whatever they want to do.
Yeah, like they did in the period of the Judges.
Yeah.
So we see here that the firstborn, the right of the firstborn was a big deal. We know that if we've read Genesis with Jacob and Esau, the deal that went through with that whole thing.
Prodigal son.
Yeah. The son, the firstborn son, he inherited everything. He inherited a lot.
Even though Reuben was the firstborn of Israel, he was still the firstborn, even though Leah was not the beloved wife.
Yeah. All through the Old Testament, you see the emphasis on the firstborn, and there's a lot. We could spend a long time talking about that because, like you said, you got Reuben and their children. You've got Abraham with Isaac and Ishmael. You've got Jacob and Esau, and different things like that. We could talk about. But we see here he says if that happens, here's what you go ahead and stick to your word of what you first started out for. Verse 18, it says, if a man have a stubborn and rebellious son, now this is sobering here. Just as we read through these verses, think about what's happened in the generations here lately, the past few generations in America, and how respect for parents or elderly in general. He says, if a man have a stubborn and rebellious son, which will not obey the voice of his father, or the voice of his mother, and that when they have chastened him will not hearken unto him, then shall his father and his mother lay hold on him, and bring him out to the elders of the city, and unto the gate of his place, and they shall say unto the elders of his city, this our son is stubborn and rebellious. He will not obey our voice. He is a glutton and a drunkard. Wow, that's blunt. that people that want to argue for social drinking, look, what about these verses? This says that the whole root of the problem was gluttonous and drunkenness, greed. It says in verse 21, all the men of the city shall stone him with stones, that he die. So shalt thou put away evil from among you, and all Israel shall hear and fear. This brings to my mind a verse in Proverbs, and you'll have to forgive me, I don't have the book, chapter, and verse right off the top of my head, but it talks about if train a child in the way he shall go, and when he's old he shall not depart. We know that verse, right? That is a general principle. Sometimes parents may raise their children and do everything right, but he still goes off the narrow path. You know, this says here, you could, you know, we even chastened our son. We gave him all the whoopings we know we could give him until he was blue in the face. But he's still rebellious. So, you know, just because just because a child was raised in the church, you know, the parents did everything. He was blessed and he had all the right guidance and everything, does not guarantee that he will stay on the straight and narrow.
And that's Proverbs 22, verse 6, by the way.
Thank you.
Train up a child in the way he should go, and when he is old, he will not depart from it.
And as I said, that's a general principle. Some people might throw that verse up in your face and say, well, that are antagonists against the Bible, and say, well, what about this verse? You know, and you have to understand that's a general principle. Generally speaking, if you do raise a child in the right way, he will not depart from it. But that's not guaranteed. There are exceptions to the rule. You know, so we need to understand the difference between general principles that we see in the Bible and other verses that are certain and sure. So, you know, this would cause the children of Israel, the actual children, what I mean is the offspring, I guess, to really want to do what's right and obey their parents. And it shouldn't just be out of fear. I mean, the fact about it is, in the Ten Commandments, it says, honor thy father and thy mother, that thy days may be long. You know, and Paul says this is the first commandment with promise here. To honor your father and your mother, that you may live a good, wholesome life, and it may go well with thee.
Yeah, nowadays in our society, if a child doesn't want to obey its parents, they'll accuse their parents of whatever they feel like, and the government will come in and throw their parents in jail, and will call in child services and do all this sorts of stuff to the parents. Back then, if the parents had enough of the child, we will drag you out. It's that concept like I grew up with when your father's like, I brought you into this world, I can take you out of it.
And now you got to remember too, this is an extreme case. I mean, this has to be, you know, it couldn't just be, you know, he didn't clean his room, so we don't.
Yeah.
This is extreme.
And here's the other thing too. A lot of people nowadays, and you'll get into topics like abortion. Mm-hmm. They'll talk about, well, in ancient Israel, parents could kill their children anytime they wanted to. Take a look at what actually happens here. The parents take it to a civil authority. It is not the parents deciding, okay, I'm tired of my son, I'm going to cut his throat and leave him by the roadside. It is not the Wild West. It is not uncivilized. It was civil authorities were involved, and it was a community decision. Yeah, this kid of yours is awful. If even you no longer see worth in this child, they carried him out and they stoned him. Yeah. And when I say child, you're probably talking about teenager or older young man who's gone out and basically started
old enough to know better.
Yeah, old enough to know better.
And I like what you said, because context is key, always. The things we're studying are in the context of civil magistrates and civil authorities. The eye for eye, tooth for tooth, and this thing about carrying your son out, it was not like a Wild Wild West thing. It was done orderly, and it was on, as I said, this is an extreme case. And I'm sure that this had to be carried out sometimes, but it was probably very rare.
Yeah, and what you see here is a case where civil authority was recognizing the authority of the parents over the children, up to and including real capital punishment.
And I don't imagine this having to use this very often, because generally speaking, the impression I get from the Bible is that most Jewish males, young males, were, you know, they had trades. They were I'm sure that most of them, you know, this hardly ever had to be carried out. Yeah. But I'm sure it did too. So, rare instances, but
God knew it was going to happen, so He put it in there.
Yeah. So, but generally speaking, I'm sure that most of these young people in Israel were probably pretty well behaved on overall, you know. But one bad apple, you know, and this is the principle that one bad apple can spoil the whole bunch. I'm sure if you talk to some elementary teachers, they'll let you know that's true. You know, that's a true statement. So, verse 20.
What happens is everybody starts acting like what they know they can get away with.
Yeah, right. He says, verse 22, and if a man have committed a sin worthy of death, and he be to be put to death, and thou hang him on a tree, his body shall not remain all night upon the tree, but thou shalt in any wise bury him that day, for he that is hanged is accursed of God, that thy land be not defiled, which the Lord thy God giveth thee for an inheritance. Can anybody think of a verse in the New Testament related to this?
Yeah, that's when they're talking about Jesus on the cross, and they were going through and they were breaking the legs of all of them that came to Jesus. He was already dead.
That one, but let's turn to Galatians chapter 3. What you're saying is right, and somebody that was executed like that was obviously some kind of grievous sin, and they were cursed. And it says in Galatians 3 verse 13, Christ hath redeemed us from the curse of the law, being made a curse for us, for it is written, cursed is everyone that hangeth on a tree. So that's where Paul is getting his verse when you read that in Galatians there, that God had it would be a curse to be executed in this fashion here. Mm-hmm. So that's where it's coming from.
But that's also why they weren't going to let him hang overnight either. They were going out and they were.
The Pharisees didn't want anybody on the cross on the Sabbath, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, what it was is they knew this law, and they were trying to follow that law, but it was the Romans that were doing the crucifying. So they were like, hey, let's go ahead and kill these guys mercifully and get them off this.
The Roman execution was very brutal, and to hasten the death by breaking the legs. I mean, that's some immense pain. That would cause shock, and you would probably pass pretty quickly after that. So,
if you look at Roman history, crucifixion was just one of many very imaginative ways of killing people that the Romans came up with.
Yeah. It was torture. So this brings us up to the end of chapter 21. Are there any questions or comments further on this one? I've realized now, from now on, I don't need to get in my head of myself. Sister Darlene looks at me like, what are you doing when I mention 2 chapters? This was just a short chapter, and we spent a good, we should probably just try to stick with a chapter at a time. So, but this was a good study. Next week, we have some interesting verses in 22 that somebody might throw up to you. Go ahead and, if you can, read this chapter, and there's going to be some strange laws that you may see in there and wonder, what in the world does that have to do with sin? And we're going to find out it may or may not, but it did. But we're going to look at it and see why they're there. I appreciate your attention tonight. Thank you for being here. Go ahead and get into our invitation portion for tonight. Tonight I want to look at an account in the book of Acts that we are very familiar with, one we've looked at before, and that is of the Ethiopian jailer. We see here where Paul and Silas were preaching the gospel, and they are put in prison. The Philippian jailer. I've got my eunuch mixed up in Acts 8 with the jailer here in 16.
Ethiopian eunuch, Philippian jailer.
So forgive me there.
Jailer in Ethiopia somewhere.
I apologize for that. The Philippian jailer in Acts chapter 16.
And a Roman centurion.
I'll just read through the account here, and we'll see what happens here. It says, at midnight, verse 25, at midnight Paul and Silas prayed and sang praises unto God, and the prisoners heard them. And suddenly there was a great earthquake, so that the foundations of the prison were shaken. And immediately all the doors were open, and everyone's bands were loosed. And the keeper of the prison, awakening out of his sleep, and seeing the prison doors open, he drew out his sword and would have killed himself, supposing the prisoners to have been fled. Now, we see here this miracle takes place. The chains are loose from off their feet. The guard, who his responsibility is to watch the prisoners, and that was his life if he didn't. And when Paul and Silas, now here's a lesson we don't usually pick up from here. Jesus said to love your enemies, not to retaliate, not to try to take vengeance. He said, vengeance is mine. If Paul and Silas could have really said, I just want to let this guy have it, they could have just let him go ahead and kill himself. That's what you get, But they stopped the man. Can you imagine being in jail and wrongfully, and your captors, and you're sitting there wishing them well and saying, don't do yourself no harm? You know, anybody else in the world probably wouldn't do that. They would say, that's good enough for you. That's what he gets. Yeah. You know, that's what he gets. But we see here they're practicing the principle of loving your enemies. Not only did they say don't do yourself no harm, they're going to offer him something even more than his physical life. It says in verse 27, the keeper of the prison, awakening out of his sleep and seeing the prison doors open, he drew out his sword and would have killed himself, supposing that the prisoners had been fled. But Paul cried with a loud voice, do thyself no harm, for we are all here. Then he called for a light and sprang in and came trembling and fell down before Paul and Silas. Now, that's a scene right there. And brought them out and said, sirs, what must I do to be saved? The most important question that a man can ask is this question right here. That's what they said in Acts chapter 2 whenever Peter preached the gospel. They didn't say these exact words, but they said, men and brethren, what shall we do? They were convicted of their sin, and they asked an inspired man, what shall we do? In other words, how do we correct this? How do we be saved? We see here that verse 31, it says, Paul and Silas, and they said, believe on the Lord Jesus Christ, and thou shalt be saved, thou and thy house. Now, a lot of times somebody will strip this verse and say, well, all you got to do is just believe in your heart that Jesus is the Son of God and you'll be saved. Well, you need to understand, what does believe, how does the Bible define the word believe? Is it, you know, we've seen over and over in our studies in Deuteronomy, in our studies in the Old Testament, in preaching, and being in the church, we know that faith of the Bible is never faith by itself. It's always followed by an action that expresses itself to be a useful faith and one that's valuable in the sight of God. That's the whole point of James chapter 2. He said, you show me your faith without your works, which is virtually impossible. He said, I'll show you my faith by my works. And so, if you understand what believe means, then yes, then you believe on the Lord and you're saved. But you got to understand what that means. It's an obedient faith. Look at the rest. You know, a lot of people, they'll stop at verse 31, but look at the rest of the story here, as Paul Harvey would say. It says in verse 32, and they spake unto him the word of the Lord, and to all that were in his house, and he took in the same hour of the night, washed their stripes, and was baptized, he and all his straightway. Now, if it was simply just by faith only, you have to answer the question, why was it so pressing for them to be baptized? Because he said, what shall I do to be saved? Paul spoke the word of the Lord, and it said they washed their stripes in the same hour. They didn't waste time. It was urgent. It wasn't something, well, we'll make a date, you know, in about a month. You'll come with your family and we'll baptize you. No, he said we're going to do it right now. And so we see that he's talking about an obedient belief, not simply accepting Jesus. And the very story itself this is not just my word. Let's look at the rest of it here. Verse 34, it says, when he had brought them into his house, verse 33. He took them the same hour of the night, washed their stripes, and was baptized, he and all his straightway. And when he had brought them into his house, he set meat before them, and rejoiced, believing in God with all his house. Now, you have to ask yourself the question, does it say that they were believers before or after they were baptized? It was after they were baptized. So, that's the Bible definition of somebody who believes in the Lord. Somebody who has said, yes, I believe he's the Son of God, but has repented, as we know from other verses, repented, confessed, and been baptized into Christ. Then, you know, after that happened, then it says that they said that they were able to have the meal and that they were believing, they were believers. So when somebody says that verse 31 says teaches faith only, you need to understand. Let's read the whole story and see if that pans out, because it really doesn't. So Acts 16 is a great account, and just remember though that context is always key. We've seen that in our Bible classes too. So we see this great success story here of a man who was ready to take his own life, and now he's. I just wonder what was the rest of his life like. You know, this changed his whole life here. He obeyed the gospel. If you're here tonight and you're not a Christian and you would like to be one, You can do that too by obeying the simple plan of salvation through repentance, confession, and baptism. These are the initial steps into the kingdom of God, into the greatest life that man can ever know. If you're a member of the church and you strayed off the narrow path, you can be brought back in the fold by repentance, confession, and prayer. We're here for you. Whatever your need is, please come as together we stand and sing.